Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to Synthesis, a new webinar series that is a joint collaboration of Inside Analysis, that's the Bloor Group, and Eckerson Group. My name is Eric Kavanaugh. I'll be your host for today's web seminar in which we're going to tackle one of the longest standing riddles in the universe. Is a single version of the truth possible? We've got a great lineup of speakers. There's yours truly at the top. Stephen Smith, Research Director for Eckerson Group. Dwayne Washington, the BI Pharaoh, as he's called. He is also with Eckerson Group. And Elena Rowell, Product Marketing Manager from Looker, an absolutely fascinating company headquartered in Santa Cruz. How can you go wrong with that? Well, folks, before I dive in, I'm just going to make a few comments here and share this interesting image I came up with a couple years ago, in fact. I was thinking about this whole industry that we're in and drawing some parallels between the business intelligence and analytics world and the world of journalism. So I came up with this concept, the square root of truth. What an interesting idea. So what is truth? Of course, you can't actually get a square root of truth. Nothing multiplied by itself equals truth, at least not in the corporeal world, I suppose. But the idea here was really to challenge the whole concept of truth and to remind people that it is a concept and it does have an elusive nature to it. So fire monkey, if you're wondering, that was the year, just over 2 years ago, in the year of the dog now. That's Chinese zodiac for those of you who find that interesting. I'm fascinated by it, quite frankly. But the general idea here was that truth is something to be sought. And to draw parallels to the world of journalism, and many of you may have heard that Tom Wolfe died just recently, you know, journalism is my first trade. And a lot of people, if you ask them, what's the job of a journalist, they would probably say something like, oh, well, to report the truth. And that is not the case at all. A journalist's job, especially a reporter, as opposed to an editor or an editorialist, a journalist's job is to provide relevant, useful, verified information to the readers, and to do so in the reverse pyramid form. You may have heard about that before, which just means you share the most important information first, and then over the course of the article, you share other verified pieces of information to follow. But what are we dealing with today in the world of media? So-called fake news. Well, I'm a journalist of many years now, and I can tell you most quote-unquote news these days is arguably fake, at least in some respect, because it violates some of the basic principles. Number one, cite your sources. Number two, do not weave editorial into news, what they call hard news reporting. Well, think about what your job is as an analyst for a company. If you're in the business intelligence or analytics world, you are what? Reporting to the business on what's actually happening. So the same rules apply, I would argue, and I throw out this reminder to folks that says, as my first publisher told me, meaning the word S-A-Y-S, should be like punctuation in a news article, meaning a news article should take the following form. This happened, he said this, she said that, and here's what we verified, which, guess what, usually is by what someone else said. So the point is, you don't want to ever read in a news article something like Senator Johnson believes such and such, or Representative Hazel Cass fears such and such. Why? Because you don't know what they believe. You don't know what they fear. All you know is what they say and what you can verify them as having done. This is a very important role in journalism that is almost just universally ignored these days. But you should never read these verbs like believes, wants, hopes, fears, desires, unless it's followed by says. He says he hopes. She says she believes. This is very important because, again, we don't know. So a journalist's job is not to report the truth. The journalist knows that the truth is elusive, and I would argue that good analysts for businesses and good people who are responsible in the world of analytics and business intelligence, they understand the same thing. You're not going to be sharing the truth. You're trying to find the bigger truth. You're trying to understand what's happening, and you're doing that by piecing together lots of little bits of information within context. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve Smith, who will begin his presentation. And feel free to send your questions in any time using the Q&A or the chat window. Steve Smith, take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Conference recording has stopped.
Oh, don't worry, that's backup.
Okay. Very thoughtful intro, Eric. Gives us lots to think about. The main thing I am thinking, though, is where do I get a snappy hat like that Tom Wolfe had? That was a pretty cool picture. So I'm going to be talking today, taking the side that the single version of the truth is not optional. In the past, I have argued that the traditional data warehouse has met its demise, or at least is optional, but that is not the case today. Single version of the truth is not a nice to have. It's a requirement for digital transformation. If you don't know what your data is, then you're not going to be able to make the right decisions. And at least for KPIs and reports that drive the company, you really need to know what the truth is. So there are basically two questions. If I can get to the next slide here. So is single version of the truth still necessary? And is it even possible? And the question is, of course, with the growing complexity of our technology, the speed of data, the big data, wide data, and dispersed data, it's just getting harder and harder to find the single version of the truth. Now, personally, I was introduced to this concept. I used to work at a company called Pilot Software back in 1995, and they were one of the first, what we now call the BI vendor, but they're then doing OLAP. And we had Ralph Kimball, one of the great grandfathers of the data warehouse from Rubrik Systems, come in and talk about the concept of the single version of the truth. And it's an idea that's been around for a while, which means we've been trying for a while. But I will say that the answer to both of these questions is definitive yes. We really do need to do it. And it's not just technically difficult, it's politically and culturally hard to implement, and even harder to maintain. So some folks get a pretty good job of single version of the truth, but then it kind of, like most things, can start to decay over time. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And it really is a necessary ingredient for a data-driven company and for digital transformation. So if we go, click on this. Let's just start off with a case study. So this is a large technology company, a data-driven company. They're doing an excellent job of driving their business through key performance indicators. What keeps analytics leaders there up at night is the fear that their CEO or CTO or CIO will get two reports with a number that's labeled with the same name, let's say revenue or profit or a number of customers, and they will get different numbers. And it is a high blood pressure inducing moment, and it's a very big deal. And for anybody who says the single version of the truth doesn't matter, then I think they're not thinking about this situation where you really have to have the right numbers when you're reporting to the board or to senior management. So they can't get answers to things like which engineers are most productive, revenue. So just consider in an organization, a software organization, you might have gross revenue, net owned revenue, recognized revenue, US GAAP, local GAAP revenue, management revenue, commission revenue, invoice revenue. These are all different versions of revenue, but they all have their own version of the truth, and they're all kind of separate versions, and they have their place in the right way they should be used. There's an example where, in this case, this company had difficulty in figuring out how productive their engineers were, and one of the problems was that in one part of the company they did time reporting with actual hours, and another place they did it with percentage. And those numbers had to be rolled up and given to the CEO in one number, and so that's kind of where the problem lies in terms of kind of pulling these different pieces of information together, especially when they get rolled up to the highest levels. So let's take a trip back through time and think about where this all came from. So if we go back to the good old days, there was a single source of truth. And this was relatively easy in the early days because it was on tape. This is the 1960s or something like that. And there truly was only one source of truth because it was a pain in the neck to move the tapes around, and you couldn't have the data copied very easily, and you certainly couldn't keep track of it. Now, one thing that's interesting is the term database was originally defined to mean a single source of data for all processing, base meaning foundation on which something depends. So when we defined the term database, we'd already kind of implicitly thought about a single version of the truth. And yet somehow we've still been grasping at it for all these years. There are two concepts, single version of the truth, which to me means everyone gets the same answer. It has a lot to do with reporting. There's also single source of the truth, which to me is more about a data model, data optimization, implementation, and removing as much redundancy as you can in the database. So we started off in the good old days with a single source of the truth, and then something went horribly wrong, and some lone IT person made a copy. The concept of extract, ETL, was born, and folks realized that they could pull a piece of data that would be appropriate just for what they wanted to use it for. A lot of times this was done just to offload the operational system. Now, interestingly, in preparation for this, I went through all of Inman's and Kimball's original data warehousing books, and nowhere in the index of the table of contents could I find any mention of the single version of the truth. So it's kind of interesting that in some ways this became recognized as a problem as we started to create data warehouses. And it was not a problem that data warehouses were necessarily meant to solve. But the next step after extracting data and making a copy of it was multi-channel. And this just compounded the problem. One question here also is, do you need a 360-degree view of your customer or your product or your employees or your vendors? And 360-degree view is very much tied into single version of the truth. And this is always a big problem for folks. If you're trying to just count your customers or your employees or your number of products, you obviously need to have some form of a 360-degree view. And one point to make here is that the finance is usually the gold standard in the organization. And the reason for that is that they have some parental oversight. They have Sarbanes-Oxley, GAAP accounting, Dodd-Frank, all these regulations that hold them accountable. So just as that was bad enough, the next thing after multi-channel was everybody started to do extracts, and you would get all these spread marks and small Excel spreadsheets. Just talking with somebody the other day, and a very large healthcare company had over 20,000 databases eventually that were built. And these 20,000 databases were actual databases. They were not tables or rows or columns. They were actual different databases. And unfortunately, the cloud exacerbates this problem a little bit just because it's so easy to spin up a database. So we got the multi-channel, we got everybody pulling out a slice, and then we got the arrival of the data lake. I'll get to that. So this is new and big data. It's usually untamed by a data model, and it reaches into a lot of these other data marks that are out there. And last but not least, the next big thing is AI and machine learning, and this is problematic just because AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, typically makes its living and has its most success by reaching in the dark corners of your databases and finding interesting things. So it exposes things that are not true or not consistent, and also doesn't work as well if you don't have a single version of the truth. So this is the state we're in today, obviously much more complicated than 1995 when we started working on the data warehouse. So I would say it's somewhat similar. We use the same analogy between me and Dwayne, is to kind of us getting the government involved and putting an Apollo space mission together. And if we borrow John F. Kennedy's words, we can actually translate them into the single version of the truth. The government is going to save us and say, this is from John F. Kennedy, we chose to go to the moon, single version of the truth, in this decade, and do the other things, which are like MDM, governance, lineage, provenance, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal was served to organize data model 360-degree view and measure the best KPIs of our energies and skills, because that challenge, digital transformation, is one that we are willing to accept and one we are unwilling to postpone. And this last one, I put GDPR there. Folks may be familiar with GDPR, but it's coming down the pike, what is today, in 9 days. And it's a big regulation that has a very hefty price tag attached to it. So this has a 4% of worldwide gross revenue as a fine if you violate privacy. And what's interesting about this is part of the tenets of GDPR is that you have to be able to find and report on all the data, match up consent, and also be able to explain how you acquired the data. And all these things are going to help us with a single version of the truth. And I think that GDPR is actually going to very much provide some parental discipline and some motivation to organizations who have known that they're supposed to do a single version of the truth but have not yet been able to implement it. So my last slide is just that things have changed for the better. They're powerful tools that have arrived. Our friends from Looker are going to talk about some of them later. Organizational best practices have also matured. And finally, senior management is motivated mostly because the government and GDPR is going to do so. So that's the end of my slides. I'll hand it over to Dwayne.
All right. Dwayne, I'm going to give you the keys to the WebEx. Take it away.
Okay, there we go. I think I have it. All right, so Steve, thanks again for opening up. Steve always does a wonderful job. He's a good friend of mine, and you know, we take opposite sides sometimes when we're talking, but let me tell you something, we're good friends, and he's definitely a great guy, great author, and some phenomenal information here that was shared. So we're talking about the single version of the truth, a study of what's possible. And Steve did a great job of laying out kind of what the issues and problems are. So if we took a look at them now, or how we got here, because after, what, 20, 30, 40 years, we're still talking about, is the single version of the truth possible? And we're still talking about it because it's a difficult thing. We've got multiple source systems, multiple data marts, spread marts, as Steve pointed out, and no consolidation of data. The strange thing is that's the same thing that we said we were creating a data warehouse to be able to solve. However, a lot of organizations still have these same challenges. Systems everywhere, data marts and databases everywhere, spread marks everywhere, and no true consolidation of the data, even in some cases when there is a full data warehouse that exists. So the question is, how do we solve it? I would like to submit that McDonald's already solved it years ago. And if we look at it from 3 different perspectives, simplification, standardization, and specialization. If we look at what it took to order a hamburger decades ago, you had to remember everything. What kind of bread should I put this on? Do I want cheese? Is it going to be a big one or a small one? Or kind of how big should they make it when they go to make it? Should I get fries with that? And how many fries? They just throw a couple of fries on there, and then if I thought it wasn't enough, then I'd ask for some more fries. All of these different decisions that had to be made that in some cases were made each and every time a burger was ordered or made. Should I get a drink with it? Should I not? What size should a drink be? Well, we only have this size cup today. Well, but yesterday you had a different size cup. Well, that's because those cups were in. But if you think about simplification, standardization, and specialization, McDonald's has solved that issue. When we go in now, as a matter of fact, they've revolutionized the entire fast food industry. We go in and we order a number 1. Even if you're not thirsty, right, you still get the drink. Here's what a burger looks like. They've defined what lunch looks like. Here's how many fries a large fry should have. Here's how many a small fry should have. And so as we go on through this, I want you to keep in mind some things that McDonald's has already put in place. They've already done it. As a matter of fact, they're returning to their roots now and even downsizing their own menu to make it smaller, make it simpler. We're going to talk about what that means in terms of BI, data warehousing, and a single version of the truth in just a moment. Now, if we look at what people are actually doing, it looks just like ordering a burger 30 or 40 years ago. People asking for reports, getting reports. And Steve pointed out, and this is exactly true, a lot of people want to go towards a single version of the truth because that's exactly what happened. They were in a board meeting, and the revenue officer came up and reported revenue, and the CFO came and reported revenue, and they were two different numbers that the CEO was getting. And because of that, we said we need a place to put all the single version of the truth. And 20, 30, 40 years later, we still are grasping at how we should be able to bring about the single version of the truth. Well, I'll say this. One of the things that we can do is we can stop writing reports and start doing business intelligence. See, the thing is, a CEO or CFO or CIO in this day and age should never have to wait on a report. They shouldn't have to wait for the CFO to tell them about revenue. They shouldn't have to wait for the HR manager to tell them how many people they hired last month. The CEO should be able to look at his cell phone and know exactly what the answers to those questions are. We should be past that. We should be past the writing reports perspective. If reports need to be written, they can be written specifically on the user side. Concentrate on the analytics side. And when I say the analytics side, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the tips. However, providing a dashboard that's simple to use, simple to understand, and has all of these answers there so that these CFOs, CEOs, and CIOs are not asking for these reports every month and every week or every quarter. It's already there at their fingertips. And therefore, you erase the possibility that two people are going to come in with two different numbers for the same exact metric because they're not coming in with that information. They're just reviewing the dashboards that are already in front of them. Once again, simplifying it, bringing the information together, just as McDonald's has done. They created that number one so you wouldn't have to worry about remembering the French fries or remembering the drink or what size you should get. They've made it very easy for you. As Steve said, the strange thing, I guess, great minds think alike. When I think about this and how we revolutionize and come to the next level, I want to look at data warehousing versus the moon landing. There is a certain statement that is said here when man stepped on the moon, and it is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. There's only one problem with that statement, though. It really means the same thing. One small step for man is all of mankind. The issue and problem is that they actually left the letter out. The quote was supposed to be, one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. We're going to see how we're going to reintroduce the single version of the truth that may redefine it for you and make it more attainable. Because here's the truth. They don't want a single version of the truth. That's the reason that in 20 years you hadn't been able to attain it. They won't want it. They can't handle the truth. And before people say, oh, that's just not true, I want to hang up, I want you to think about it for those people who implement BI. How many times have you had this conversation with an individual and said, you know what, we're going to create a report for you. And this report is going to be automated. It's going to come out every day. And they say these words, before the report comes out, is there any way I can take a look at the information and data and be able to approve it before it comes out? And you'll see that at every level, even at the C level. They'll say, well, I don't know if I want the shareholders to see this particular dashboard. Is there any way we can check off on the information prior to it going to our shareholders? Which means that they don't want a single version of the truth. They're wanting to check it at every level. Now, that may not be a problem, right? And for those that think, well, no, that's Dwayne, you don't understand. We really do want a single version of the truth. Okay, then ask a revenue manager how many sales they make, how many customers they have. And ask the CEO how many customers they have. And ask the CFO how many customers they have. All of those three people are going to look at the information differently. One is going to say, well, I'm counting the customers that are 90% approval. One is going to say, I'm counting the customers that we have actually signed a contract with. Somebody else is going to say, I'm only counting the customers that we've actually delivered the information or delivered the product to. That's at the point I start calling them a customer. Well, the thing is, all of those are valid. They're just not the same thing. So it'd be hard to get to a single version of the truth. Quite honestly, that's not what they're looking for. Well, what are they looking for? What they're looking for is a single version of a truth, single version of their truth, which isn't always bad. That's not saying that it's a lie. It's just that there are different versions that are told to different people. Maybe you want to report revenue over here and not include taxes. Somewhere else you want to put sales, which may be different from your revenue, and that's fine, right? But you want to be able to know prior to that we're not looking at the same thing. You create the dashboard has sales, you have an explanation of sales, and you keep moving, right? So that way the CEO has an example of what this information is on his dashboard, there's no question, and you keep moving. You don't try to solve the problem of trying to make everybody agree on one particular thing. It doesn't work. It works in theory, but it actually doesn't work. So don't try to get complete consensus for every single metric that you're seeing. You know, try to get the whole company to agree on what revenue means. Good luck on that. What you may want to do is start with a particular department. Say it's finance or marketing, and say from a marketing perspective, what does this mean for you? From a sales perspective, what do you call a sale? And get that answer from them and put it on the dashboard and produce that directly to the C-level. When you get used to doing that and doing it well, you'll find that the conversation changes. And when the conversation changes because you provided them something that they can actually see visually, then they start doing analytics. Then they start really handling the actual problem instead of complaining and arguing that the numbers don't match. But you want to be able to define it in a way that they can see, identify, and move with very, very quickly. If you do it right, they'll be able to look at a dashboard and within 3 seconds be able to know exactly where their data is, exactly where their company is. Remember, from a C-level perspective, these people need to know where I need to spend my time, and they don't have a lot of time to spend. So let's not make them spend time arguing over what revenue number is correct. So let's look at some very, very specific tips in closing. Agree on the micro. Don't worry about the macro, right? So agree in small different areas. Get your sales organization to understand what sales volume is, and then report that on a dashboard. Define these small areas. Make them important areas, but define them in small areas. Make it available, and I'm talking about your reports and your dashboards, whether they're on your phone, iPad, the web. Make them available widely and easily, right? Make sure that everyone can get to them. Make sure your C-level can get to them. Don't hide them from people, especially when you're talking about from a 100,000-foot level. Make sure that you report where people are. And once again, I'm harping on your C-level right now, but this could be any level of the organization. If you have a sales force that's not in the office and never uses a laptop, make sure that you're providing that information on their cell phone. If you have an organization that doesn't have cell phones, but they're all together in maybe a call center, make sure you're providing that information on a large screen so that they can all see it. Report where people are. Once again, let the dashboard define it. Instead of spending time arguing over what's here every single time you create a report, let the dashboard define it. If you go to McDonald's, the dashboard they put in front of you is defining what a burger looks like. It defines what a Big Mac looks like. It defines what a large fry and small fry looks like and how much you're going to pay if you order those. Let the dashboard define it. Come up with it, put it on the dashboard, and let it define it. If you're trying to go any other route, it's going to be long, laborious, and it probably is not going to work. And this last piece is very important. Standardize on your tools on the front end. Because there are so many tools that are available that all do phenomenal and great things. Some people have resorted to the bring your own tool. Well, that gets us back to even a bigger problem with the single version of the truth, right? Because now you're making your executives look at 4 or 5 different tools to be able to get an answer to a problem and question. Don't do that. Define and standardize your tool set, right? Figure out what you're going to use from a reporting and OLAP perspective and utilize that so that whether it's your managers, whether it's your C-level executives, your SVPs, your EVPs, they're all looking at the same thing, right? Don't give them 15 different tools to look at because you couldn't agree on it. That's where you need to spend your time and get some consensus, right? So that the tool is standardized, so the same thing is going to the same people. Non-standardization in your tools actually makes getting to a single version of any truth that much more difficult. And with that, I'm out. Thank you so much for listening. I'll turn it over to Looker.
Okay, yes, Elena Rowell, I'm going to hand the keys to the WebEx over to you. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okie dokie. Let's see. So thank you so much for that setup, both Stephen and Dwayne. I think listening to it is actually, I love some of your takes on some of this stuff. So really what I see is that there's two really big pieces of this, and a lot of the conversations get stuck in the conversations around technology and how we do this, with the data. And what kind of gets lost is the discussion around how we then enable people to use this and, push it in for the people and then in the process of it. So the technology is, as Stephen said, there's been huge advancements in the amount of data that we have, but, these are things that we can figure out. So figure out how you're going to store it, how that data is accessed. And one of the key things that he hit was that maintenance piece. A single version of the truth is accurate on that day, but businesses are always changing, and creating something that is locked, that is, something very, very static, will end up becoming more cumbersome, because when metrics do inevitably change, or you have regulations like GDPR come in, you end up with something that you're needing to now go back and edit in a really, really deep way. And so for me, I would say that it's less almost about that single version of the truth and more about that single source of truth. And that's actually something that Stephen was touching on, because to me, what we see is that a version of the truth has some sort of, personal touch on it. This is my version of it, as opposed to a single place where people can go and access things that are truthful, access things that are, blessed by the analytics department, so to speak. And so that's where kind of the people and the process piece come in. There's three really key components of making sure that the people in the process are able to support this, single version of the truth that you've created, the single source of truth, I guess I should say. The first is that communication piece. If people don't understand why they need to use something, or they don't understand how things are defined, then they lose a lot of the value there. And so for a product, any product becomes sticky for people, even if it's a dashboard or whatever it is. They have to understand why things are happening and be able to dig into that. They also need to have access to it and have it available for them when they want it. That's like what Dwayne was saying about not having to wait for reports to be delivered to you. They also need to trust it. If you see two different numbers in your system, you're going to want to go with the number that looks the best for your department. And so making sure that everything is aligning and that it's very clear that these are kosher definitions is important. And then just stressing the importance to people. It has to be a top-down approach. If the CEO only accepts dashboards from a certain tool or only accepts things that have come through a certain process, it's going to force people, right, into using that and into using that source of truth. Now, we don't just want to force people to do things, we want them to want to do things. And so this boils down into the why. Why does this benefit me as a user to access my data from this single source of truth? And so the first is giving people meaningful metrics. MRR, for example, is not a metric that I personally can move. However, if you're able to expose people to metrics that actually drive business and they can really push on, then they're going to be a lot more incentivized to access that data and to use that data. And so the ability to feel like you're actually, changing something in the data is super powerful. And with that goes the idea of ensuring fairness. I think it was Dwayne that mentioned 4 or 5 different versions of revenue. Stephen, oddly enough, mentioned about 100 versions of revenue. And revenue is a very broad thing, but I mean, even just in a notion of what is a customer, having everybody come together and define what a customer is a way that people then feel like they're working towards the same thing, and they're not ending up in a situation where they are being, you know, kind of thrown under the bus for using a wrong metric that's actually kind of detrimental to them. And then the last thing is just powering everything with it. Putting that data where the people are, and using that single source of truth to not just be a single access point to a dashboard, but to actually power, you know, your product with it, and pushing it into internal sources and pushing it back into Salesforce, and, you know, putting it where people are is a really helpful way to get them to use it. And then the last piece is customization. You know, we talk about a single source, but there's also this notion of a narrative. And I want to be able to put together a story around why something happened. And it's possible to do that from a single source of truth where you're not torturing the data into submission. But people have to be free to be able to do that, to create the narratives they want from that single source of truth. They then have to, in order to do that, obviously, be able to dig into the data. If you can't dig down into those metrics, dig down into those numbers, in that single source, you're going to have to go elsewhere. And so you have to also empower people to get the freshest, most row-level detail possible from that source. The last piece here is celebrating successes. I think that this is kind of something that goes overlooked. People love getting praise. It sounds silly, but, you know, showing people that it's possible and that it's productive and, you know, incentivizing them and celebrating them for doing that is really important. So all in all, you need both the technology and you also need the people in the process. So I'm actually, before we go into the Q&A, I'm going to pop open our product Looker. And so we strongly believe in creating a central source of truth. It's kind of something that our very being is based on. So if you can see here, I'm at this dashboard. So this is our business pulse. So this is the company's KPIs. Everybody knows that there have been 2,298 users acquired, and we can see here that this is in the past 30 days. Obviously, this can be filtered, you know, to adjust it for the information that you need, but it's all reverting back to the same central source. And so as we go down here, we can see that these are the metrics that this big e-commerce company has decided are really what drives their business. And what we can do, because what I said is what's interesting is you have to be able to dig in, is we can take something like user behavior by traffic source, and we can open it up, at which point we get down into the data. We get down into the nitty-gritty of it. And we can see here that this is that same visualization with the same numbers that we saw on that dashboard, but now we also have the data side of it. And what I'd really like to know is that I don't think that just lifetime orders and average sales price is representative. So what I really want to know about is our 30-day repeat purchase rate. And this is one of those numbers that you're maybe not 100% sure how it's defined. And so putting even just like informational widgets here that help people understand what's going on and see, you know, have that insight into it. So now we can see here, we've added that to it, and if we sort by, you know, average sale price, we can see that organic and search and Facebook is the order. But if we're an e-commerce company, one of our biggest things that we want to do is actually not just have someone buy once, but someone keep coming back. And 30 days is what we've decided is that key rate. If we want to go up here and see what a different rate for a different time period, it's also possible. But then, you know, it's going in and it's adding the things that you want. and adding and slicing dicing the data in more ways so that you can find what you need in it, creating your own custom narrative from that single source of truth. And so how do we get here? And this is kind of the secret sauce, so to speak, of Looker. So if we go back to that repeat purchase rate, I can see here I have this little button, and what I can do is go into the LookML. And so what Looker is doing behind the scenes is actually writing super advanced SQL to be able to pull this live from your database. So this connection, I believe, is running on Redshift, but whatever that central data source is, be it something like Redshift, BigQuery, or Snowflake, or the SQL on Hadoop, Presto, and Spark, whatever it may be, running that against that, and then we can see that it's defined here in the back end. And this is one place where it's been decided by the group and been blessed by analytics that this is how we calculate this. And so every time we look at 30-day repeat purchase rate anywhere in this product, it's always going to calculate it this way. And as a company, if we decided that 30-day repeat purchase rate is great, but it's actually more significant if someone repeat purchases in 24 days. And if we need to change that, it's a simple matter of going into this code and just editing the numbers and saving it, and it populates back to everything here. And so that's not just, this one report, but it's also back up, there we go, to that dashboard that we were at earlier, and to every stakeholder in the company that's seeing these metrics. And then, having something that's web-based, as Dwayne was saying, you need to be able to find people where they are. And so whether it's using the Looker API to push this out into, a Confluence page, or embedding an iframe in Salesforce so that the sales team can see something like this, or the sales team can have it automatically filtered on, the city that they represent, is again pulling from that central source, but giving them what they need to do their jobs. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can have some discussion.
Yeah, you can even keep sharing. I love looking at that video. I love looking at the imagery that you've got there. And, I view what Looker has done really as a straw in the wind, as they say, because it seems to me the old world way of building a data warehouse to achieve this single version of the truth, or at least to achieve a cohesive view of the organization's status, if you will, it's just broken. It cannot survive in the modern world because there are so many data sources now, there are so many different data types, the amount of data is so significant. So to me, the only way organizations are going to be able to ride this information wave and not get overwhelmed by a wave crashing down upon them is to take this kind of approach. But I'll throw that out to each of our speakers. Let's maybe start with Steve Smith. What do you think about that, Steve? Do you think the old model for data warehousing is just no longer sufficient to handle this kind of need, or what's your thought?
Yeah, I think that if you go, in my last slide, where we had this jumbled interaction of, everything from machine learning to data lakes to original data stores, that is the reality for many companies. This company, an outlier, but 20,000 databases. Just imagine how many, data marts and things like that they had created. I think Elena mentioned, that this is, much a political and cultural issue as it is a technical one. I think we have the technology to do this, and I think it is doable, but it is very complex. But I think it has to do a lot with data governance. Think about the requirements of lineage, provenance. Those are all have to do with truth, right? If you know where the data came from, you know a lot about whether it's true or not. And the problem has been that there just hasn't been any kind of, emotional need at the highest levels to really make this happen. And I really think that this privacy law in Europe could be a very beneficial catalyst to help to get these things done in large organizations.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And let me throw it over to Dwayne. What are your thoughts on the Looker model for achieving perspective and insights versus the old-fashioned way of building data warehouses?
Well, I think that I like the Looker model. And I think that in that when you talk about the old version, I think that like there's an old model before the old model, And if we go back to the simplicity of things, the Looker model makes perfect sense because it's returning to our roots. I mean, if we think about it, a good friend of mine helped me to realize, he said, Dwayne, people did business for thousands of years before computers. And when you think about something like the Dr. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech, like 250,000 people showed up to hear him speak on the front steps of Washington. And yet they didn't have the internet. They couldn't make phone calls like we make now. They didn't have email. There was no Twitter, but they made it happen from a grassroots perspective. And if you look at the concepts that it took to make that happen, they're the concepts that we need to have in our business now. And I think what happens is that, like Steve saying, the 20,000 databases, we overcomplicate things and then therefore need an overcomplicated solution. If we simplify what's there, I think that the Looker model makes sense, and I think that the end result is going to make sense. But I think that somewhere between the 1970s and 80s and 2018, we complicated the model unnecessarily. And therefore created all of the issues and problems that we see now. So I think that we need to revert back to some simplification. We don't need 50 different CRMs. We just need to know about our customer base. I just think that a simplification is needed because if we don't do that, I don't know that the implementation of any model is going to work out for us.
Mm-hmm. And Elaine, I'll throw this over to you. A data warehouse can be just one source of information for Looker, right?
Yeah, actually, if you could give me the controls back, I'd love to share my screen again. I just wanted to pull up a slide that I had that I realized really, there we go, demonstrates this. So this is the Looker architecture. I hope that everybody can still see this. But what we see is that we're pulling from those CRM sources. We're pulling from everything that we have, our transactional data, our event data, and we're pushing it into these centralized sources. And, the warehouses and the power that's on the market today is really astounding. And then on top of that, we're putting Looker, and this is where that LookML modeling layer comes in, and this is that governed space. It's also version controlled, obviously, so which has great benefits for tracking down any issues that do arise. But then with this, you've created a data platform from which you can then push your source of truth out to everything. So we actually have quite a number of customers who use Looker's platform to power all of their data science. Stack Overflow, for example, uses Looker to power all of their Python and all of their R scripts that they run, and then they push that back into these data warehouses and give it to users back up in Looker. And so this kind of centralized single platform that's able to leverage this power under here instead of having to rely on something it builds itself is super powerful.
Yeah, I have to agree because the bottom line is that the age of consolidation, I think, of actual physical consolidation is over. I have to believe that. And even though we have this concept of a data lake, which theoretically is a consolidation of a kind, it's one that's not necessarily engineered all that tightly, at least not the way a data warehouse was. But Stephen Smith, what do you think about that assessment?
Just that the day of moving the data is gone, is what you're saying?
Yeah, the days of consolidating all of your information assets into a data warehouse are over. It's not, I don't think the warehouse is capable of delivering on that promise anymore, and so you're going to need to have a more federated view of your information landscape that pulls from a variety of different systems at various levels of data structure.
Yeah, it's just got to be more nimble. You need that abstraction layer that, you know, like Looker and other folks have. If you just look at the rate at which new data sources, wholly new data types are being added or have been added in the last 5 to 10 years of, you know, blobs and text and video and audio and images, and more to come. Those are just the types of data, right? And then there's actual instantiations of the data. One thing that we see that breaks the data warehouse all the time is company acquisitions, which you think might be sort of a rare event, except for the fact that the companies you see today generally are the companies that have survived, and the companies that have survived generally have been the successful ones, and the successful ones are the ones that do a lot of acquisitions. So almost by definition, the companies, certainly the big companies out there, have done a lot of acquisitions of new data. And it just may be the case where, you know, think of this 20,000 database example. About half of those databases, nobody really knows what they are or what they do, but nobody wants to touch them. Nobody wants to mess with them. So in some ways they're doing the right thing. You leave the databases alone, but make sure you have an abstraction layer that basically tells you as much as you know what's in them. And that abstraction layer can be much more agile and nimble than a monolithic data model where you actually have to, you know, move and optimize the data structures. I think I totally agree that those days, if they ever existed, are certainly gone now with the speed at which data is changing.
Right. Dwayne, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I believe that the well-built traditional data warehouse will be around for a long time. So when you look at a place that you can look at enterprise, look at your data in an enterprise way that gets the queries away from your front-end systems. So information, whether it's HR, finance, sales, or just operations, but getting that data away from your front-end OLTP systems to put it in a nice enterprise format. I don't think that's going away. But what does need to happen, there are some information that we call never save. So, for example, when you have data on weather, data from social media, Twitter feeds, that type of thing, you probably never want to bring that into your data warehouse, but you do want to report on it maybe next to some of your CRM data, which may also be in a different cloud database that you may not bring into your data warehouse. So you do need a tool that says, I can look into my traditional enterprise data warehouse to see the information that's kept, let's just say, behind the firewall, but I can also take and match that data up with non-traditional data, like social media feeds, for example, feeds associated with claims that are outside of your data warehouse. Maybe some other data that you're keeping in a online or AWS or Azure database that you need to match up with things on site. I don't, or maybe you're looking at map data that you don't want to save, but you just want to be able to use the API to pull in. So I think both of those will exist, and they'll exist in bigger formats. I don't believe that the enterprise data warehouse is going away or that it even needs to go away. I think that if we get away from it too long, we're going to cause the problem that we were trying to solve with ETL to begin with, and crashing OLTP systems because of the amount of queries that are coming at them and the fact that we can't mandate whatever those queries are. We have tools now that build SQL on the fly, so you don't even know what SQL is coming at them. So I don't think that we should abandon the enterprise data, a well-built enterprise data warehouse, but I do think that there are some things that we need to add to it. And you do need to have a tool that's nimble enough and that's robust enough to say that I can take weather data, social media data, data associated with maybe sentiment, Twitter sentiment, and match that up with my sales information inside of a traditional sales database and be able to give it to me in seconds or sub-seconds. So I think you need both. I don't think the data warehouse is going away. I see too many companies that that are still struggling to get that data warehouse. And if you think that you're going to leapfrog that, I believe that can cause an issue as well. So my personal view is that you're going to need both, and you're going to need a tool that's able to handle both.
Yeah, okay, I was actually, sorry, I just want to jump in and say, like, I would, agree with the idea, and I think what it really is that it's all shifting. It's all shifting to the cloud, which has just completely changed how you think about things. Looker actually, we saw that issue with people wanting weather data, and so we've stored weather data in, I believe it's in a public S3 bucket and then also in Google Cloud Storage. And we have a model, a Looker model that's built that you can just join into your Looker model and, from there, be able to access that weather data in conjunction with your sales data or whatever it is. And so that agility to be able to leverage technologies like that is super key.
Yeah, good point. And we have a bunch of very specific questions that I will be sure to pass on to our presenters today, so we'll make sure to get these questions answered. But we do have a heavy hitter from the industry chiming in, and I want to throw this out over to you, Elena. So one of our, and yes, we will have a recording available. It's usually available within a few hours of the event completing. So one attendee writes, based on the discussion, it would appear that to support a consistent semantic layer and an accurate metadata layer will require a fairly significant governance and development/review process to ensure that the mapping of data sources and the creation of the semantic layer follows an understandable set of naming conventions. Is there any sort of magic or agility that's unique to Looker to enable this? Elena?
Of course. I think that that's exactly right. I mean, it's agreeing on how you define something like a customer is not a casual conversation that you have. It's something that requires your business to really think about it and then go off and see how it feels and fits into your organization. From Looker's standpoint, what I'll say is that a good portion of the model is generated based on the tables that it finds when it connects. And so that gets you up and running with kind of the base. But what we do have is that everything is very reusable. And so I showed that 30-day repeat purchase rate. And the great thing is that you go in and you define that, let's say a customer or an active customer or whatever it is, and you define it in one place, and then you serve it out to everybody, and every iteration of that metric is adjusted to take that into account. And so I think it's more about the scalability of it and like the ability to support adjustments there. At some point you're going to change out what you're using for your HR data platform or whatever it is. And being able to swap that in the background and not losing all of your company's, definitions, all that metadata is super key and really helps for scaling.
Mm-hmm. And there was a specific question. I mean, I think you've already answered it to a significant degree, but I'll just throw it out there for clarity. One of the attendees was asking, does Looker have capabilities to standardize data, i.e. CALIF, C-A-L-I-F equals CA equals California? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes, right?
Yeah, it has basically anything that you could do in SQL, regardless of how many rows how many lines of code it would take you, can be done in Looker, and it can be done in a scalable way.
Okay, good. Well, folks, we've burned through an hour here on our show today. Very, very big thank you to both our analysts today, Stephen Smith and Dwayne Washington. And it's always great having Elena Rowell on the show. Looker is a very interesting company. I really think you guys are onto something. I think you found a very effective and strategic way to manage this remarkably unwieldy world we have these days of information assets. It's getting more complex by the minute, and I think solutions like this are going to help us all maintain our sanity and achieve that coveted single view of the truth, single version of the truth. And with that, we're going to bid you farewell, folks. We do archive all these webinars for later viewing. Up online to insideanalysis.com later on today. It should be available to you. And of course, you can always email yours truly, info@insideanalysis.com or info@dmradio.biz. And if you're into our radio show, DM Radio hits the airwaves again tomorrow. Talk to you soon, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.